All right, well, it's 12 o'clock on the dot. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I just want to say happy Thursday to all of you. Welcome to Anatomy of a Residential Real Estate Transaction. My name is Racole Jackson. I am honored to come before you guys today to have this conversation and just facilitate a conversation to bring some understanding and clarity around the processing of a residential real estate transaction from contract to close from the realtor side. Just gonna silence my phones really quickly, getting all the notifications. So again, my name is Racole Jackson. I am the managing attorney of Realty Law Group. I'm also a full service real estate law firm. I'm also the chief visionary officer of Title Xperts, a full service title insurance and settlement firm. I am the chief executive officer of Lending Experts, a full service lending company, and I am also the curator of the Agent CEO Club. It is a coaching program for realtors to get them control over their business and their lives. Just to give you guys a little bit of background about my education and how I got to this point, because I think it's always relevant to the conversation. I did attend the University of Florida for my bachelor's degree. Go Gators! If there's any Seminoles in the room, and my Juris Doctorate, my law degree, I obtained from Santa Clara University School of Law in California. I did come back. I am originally from Miami, Florida. I did come back home to Miami and got my LLM in real property development from the University of Miami School of Law. And I am proudly a licensed real estate salesperson in Florida. I say that because oftentimes when I'm presented as the attorney, sometimes it's like, oh, well, you don't understand what we do. You don't understand. Well, listen, I do understand. I always tell my colleagues I was licensed. I got my real estate license in California while I was in law school. And I started out in commercial real estate with Cushman and Wakefield, Marcus and Millichap. Once I came back over to Florida, continued in commercial, also got into distressed real estate and residential real estate. So I say that to say, been in the trenches with you, still in the trenches with you, not necessarily in production. You won't see any properties listed or parties represented by me on the residential side. But my family's in real estate. My husband's a broker. If anyone's on who knows me personally. And so again, I say that to say my goal is always to get you not just to the closing table, but out the door with your commission checks. And so I always make sure to give that introduction so that it's understood that I get it, if nothing else, right? So really quickly, and this is always different when we have we're having these trainings now with Zoom versus in person post COVID. But I want to see in the chat because I like to know who's in the room. Because one thing about this, we can always tailor our discussion to who's in the room. There's information, but there's information that could be delivered tailored to who's in the room. So my first question is, how many years? And I want to see the chat. How many years have you been in real estate? Drop that in the chat for me. 4, 13. New to real estate page, less than a year, a few months, 13, 3, 1 month. I love it. 1 month, new 13. Richard, 13, 10, 18, 39, 14 outside the country, 35. Jenny, I think you might have the record. Gosh, I'm trying to remember. Jenny, I think you might have the record. I think you do. I think you do. I always, gosh, I want to remember. If you don't have the record, you're close enough. So congratulations on being in 15, working on being more active. That's right. 38. Well, I think Jenny, I think you still might have the record. Oh, is this your first class on this topic? Let me get a yes or a no. Is this your first class on yes? No? Okay. 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 No. Okay. No. Got some no's. Got some yeses and some no's. Okay. 45. All right. Beryl. So Beryl, then Jenny. Okay. And then last question is, what do you hope to learn and master today. If it's everything, then it's everything. It's funny when we were in person again, everyone would be like, everything. I just want to know everything. Everything. Awesome. Awesome. If there's any specific areas that you want to hone in on, anything that gets you, that's right. Always something worth learning. Everything exactly, and protect that. Okay. All right. As much as possible. Awesome. 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 To become a better TC. Let's go, Sherry. Love it. Leveraging the details on, okay. Okay. Um, possession of keys at closing. I think I know where you're going with that. Dealing with short sales foreclosure options. We actually did a class on that. We won't get into that too much today, Paola, but I'll definitely make a note to make sure that we have that. I just taught a class on that last month. I'm not sure if it was with the board, but I do sit on the education committee for the board. And so I'm going to make note of that, Paola, and also my email address is at the end. If there's any, I always make this open invitation. If there's any topic, you guys, that you're not seeing offered on the calendar that you would like to see, please shoot me a message. My email address will be on the last slide. This is all we do. We just we receive this feedback, and we want to ensure that the curriculum that's being offered through the board suits your needs. So thank you so much for your participation. And with that being said, this is where we are today. So anatomy of a residential real estate transaction. This is a discussion about executing the agreed upon terms of the purchase and sale agreement. What does that mean? That means this discussion is about making sure that the seller, the buyer, and everyone involved in the transaction does what they said they would do. We're abiding by the terms of the contract. It is a discussion about managing common tasks associated with maneuvering a transaction from contract to close. So last month we did a discussion on the closing process for realtors. And so I facilitated the conversation where we talked about what are we doing on the title side once you send over that the contract? What does that look like? Giving you more clarity around that so that you can assist your clients when they have questions about why title is asking them for this, or title is saying yes, they can, or no, they can't. And so last month was that conversation. What does it look like on the title side? Today, we're staying on the realtor side, and what does it look like on the transactional side from contract to close? What should you be looking at? What dates should you be tracking like a hawk? And what conversation should you be having from contract to close? Also today is a discussion about managing the timelines, i.e. deadlines, right? And so when we're completing a contract outside of the name, purchase price, and other special terms, the majority, a good amount of what we're putting in are what dates, right? When is escrow deposit? When is closing date? That's what we want to know. When is the loan approval due? When are we making a loan application? So there's a lot of dates that are very important that we're agreeing to in the contract that we want to make sure not to miss them. And so this is very much a conversation about that. And finally, it's a discussion about the common missteps that occur in the contract to close process that can be disastrous to a transaction. Let's be honest, there are some errors that can be fatal. And so hopefully after we have this conversation today, you guys won't be one of the ones to make those mistakes. At the end of the class, you will have a comprehensive understanding of how to effectively manage the executed agreed upon terms of the contract. How do I manage this? How do I make sure that everyone does what they said they would do? You're also going to have a timeline abstract tool to track critical dates and deadlines. I'm going to send that to you guys via email. Those who have registered, when I send out the recording, I'll include this one sheet form that we use, that you can use for tracking your timeline. And then you're going to be aware of common missteps that compromise a successful transaction. What are some things that come up that you want to absolutely avoid? Sometimes it's impossible to make otherwise. I tell you, Angel, that's an underwriter that you don't work with again. I tell you that. So I see that, and it happens. And so that's something that we're going to talk about once we get to the finance and contingency details of the contract, but unfortunately it does happen. And guess what? There's some things you can do to address that 100%. And there's some things that you must do in order to address that. So a little bit of background, I just want to make sure that we hit concerning the purchase contract. One, you want to ensure that the purchase contract is fully executed with all pages initialed and signed. It's not to say now it absolutely must be signed by the parties. If an initial on the page is missing, that does not make the contract void and unenforceable. What it does do is when a page is initialed at the bottom of every page, if a provision in that particular page becomes in dispute, and either the buyer or the seller it's against the buyer or the seller, and they've initialed the bottom of the page, it's going to say, well, you can't say you didn't know because your initial is at the bottom of this page. And so the initials themselves do not necessarily at the bottom of the page. I want to be clear, at the bottom of the page, although you want to absolutely make sure that you don't miss an initial. Why should you miss an initial? And then obviously if you're using an electronic format, it should guide your clients through signing the contract such that those signatures are not missed. However, if it's manually executed, missing an initial at the bottom of the contract is not absolutely fatal. It is the signatures that are needed. Now, obviously, if there are changes that are made, and they're in a counter situation, and an initial is not made on a change, then technically that term has not been accepted. So just want to be clear there. You want to be sure that all pages and riders are included in delivery to all parties. If you've taken a contract class, then you know that some riders are very key, and the buyer's obligation as it relates to that rider is not engaged. It is not the clock does not start ticking until they get that rider. What are they? So primarily you're looking at the condo rider, the HOA rider. It's specifically there in bold font that the buyer has X number of days from receipt of this rider to review the information and either cancel the contract or have some other discussion, right? And so what are you saying, Racole? I'm saying when you send that contract, if it's within an HOA or condo association, make sure those riders are attached. Make sure, because the clock starts ticking as it relates to their responsibilities once they receive that rider. You want to make sure that there are no blanks on the contract. If you, and again, I don't have one in front of me, the contract, visualize down the left side of the contract are asterisks in certain areas. And those asterisks are for, one second, one second here. For some reason, you guys have, all right. Had the ability to annotate. Yeah, a lot going on today. You want to make sure the down the left rail of the contract are asterisks throughout the contract, and that's an indication to you where there is a blank or where there is information where you need to select one of the terms, right? So party name, purchase price, address, escrow date, anywhere where you see an asterisk, you need to run your eye down the left side of the contract, go into the body of the contract and ensure that there are no blanks in that contract. No blanks. There's no reason for there to be any blanks. I cannot make that any more clear. If it's not relevant, say for example, there is no home warranty being given to the buyer, then select NA. Do not leave it blank, because the last thing you want is a conversation where the contract it's sent over, and all of a sudden there is a home warranty and there is information filled in saying that the seller is going to contribute $599 toward a home warranty. And now you're saying, what? I never said that. Well, you left it blank. And so to leave nothing to interpretation or discussion or clarification, just make sure that every blank is filled in your contract. And finally, you want to ensure there are no conflicting terms. Most common example of that is the section regarding title insurance. Who's selecting the title agent? I have seen all three selected. That's not how it works. Select one. Jenny's laughing. I've seen it. Select one of the items on the contract of who's selecting title. All right. All right, let me check the chat really quickly. All right, what defines delivery contract? We're going to touch that. Joseph, good question. So, managing the timeline. These are some of the high points that you see on the screen here. These are the high points of deadlines that you need to be aware of in managing the transaction. The escrow deposit deadline, the first and second, third, fourth, if that's what you've agreed to. The inspection period, the loan application and the loan approval deadline, the association application and approval deadline, the title commitment to the buyer. Did you notice that there is a deadline for the seller to ensure that the title commitment is delivered to the buyer? There is one. The survey deadline. By when should the buyer review the survey and make any objections to the results of the survey? There is a deadline for that. The final walkthrough and then closing date. You want to ensure that all of those dates are logged and that you're tracking them for no issues. Let me see something really quickly. Make sure. All right, now we got that annotation off there. Computing time periods. You want to be sure that you are using the appropriate measure to compute your time period. We know that we have two contracts. We have the FAR bar as is contract and we have what's considered the CRISP, right? So the FAR bar as is contract, the time periods are calculated using calendar days. Calendar days. What does that mean? That means that you count every day within that time period. You count Sunday to Saturday. We also have the CRISP. The CRISP utilizes business days. So the CRISP is counting Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. How do we know the difference? Well, it's in the heading of your contract. Is it a FAR bar as is, or is it a contract, a residential contract for purchase and sale? 99% of the time you're using a FAR bar as is. But again, I say 99% of the time. You cannot just assume that you are using a FAR bar as is and not pay attention to the heading of it. But 99% of the time you are receiving a FAR bar as is. All right. One thing, guys, is so that we can stay on track with the slides, hold on to your questions, or at the very least, you know what, as you think about them, let's do this. Go ahead and drop your questions in the chat, and then I will answer them at the end. So that you don't lose your train of thought and you don't forget what your question is as we go through. Definitely go ahead and drop them in. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just going to make sure that I answer them at the end. All right. But those are all good questions everyone has asked so far. So thank you for your questions. Now, with computing time periods, the first thing that we must know is the effective date, because the effective date is the starting point for calculation of all time periods. If that's wrong, then everything's going to be wrong, right? So the effective date is the date, and this question was asked just a little while ago. The effective date is the date when the last of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed the purchase contract and delivered the final version of the contract to the other party. Sign and deliver. Receipt is not there. I think the question was asked about, you know, if you don't check your inbox, I don't have control of that. But it was delivered. And it's when the last of the buyer or seller has signed or initialed the purchase contract. So what does that mean? If I'm representing the seller and now I'm going to represent the buyer. Not representing the seller. I'm going to control the deal. I'm representing the seller, and I receive a contract. I receive an offer from Jenny, from her buyer, and Jenny sends over an offer. Her offer is for 1.2 million. My listing's for 1.5 million. My seller signs my seller strikes through the 1.2 million, writes in 1.35 million. Initials there, signs every other page. I send the contract, I send the document, call the document to be clear, back to Jenny. Do we have a contract? Jenny's client has signed. She initially signed everything when the offer was sent to me for 1.3 million. My client signed everything. Additionally, my client struck through the it was 1.2. My client struck through the 1.2, wrote in 1.35 initial and sent it back to Jenny. What does Jenny's client now have? Jenny's client now has a counter offer that her client must initial the change, the 1.35, and send it back in order for us to have an effective contract with a fully executed contract with an effective date of whatever the date is that it was sent back to me. Does that make sense? If there's any questions, you guys feel free to come off mute and ask your question. I don't want you guys to feel restricted by the fact that we're in the Zoom environment. So I don't have all the tiles up, but literally feel free to just come off mute, ask your question, and we'll have that conversation. All right. So, pro agent tip. Because the effective date is the date by which we're going to measure everything, the escrow due date, the loan application date, the loan approval date, the inspection period, we need to be clear on what that is, right? So we want to always confirm the effective date in your initial email upon delivery or receipt of a fully executed contract. Now, I think Paige was our TC in the class today. And so Paige, obviously, when she gets her contract, this is one of the things that a transaction coordinator does. However, if you're a solo agent and you're kind of manning the ship that day, maybe your TC's out. When I get that, when Jenny gets that, that counter offer back from me for the 1.35 million with all of their terms being the same, and her client signs and she sends it back, Jenny should say, hey, Racole, congratulations, we're under contract. Our effective date is April 15th. See you at the closing table. Let's get this money. Because you want to confirm the effective date. You don't want there to be any confusion about what the effective date is. Alternatively, let's say Jenny's so excited, we under contract for 1.35 million. She's like dropping it like it's hot, like just send. Okay. She don't say anything to me. I get it back. I'm excited too. I respond back, yay, Jenny. I received your contract. We're good. I will let her know. Our effective date is April 15th. Someone needs to confirm the effective date because we're all excited now. We're in the honeymoon phase, and then we get down to, let's say, loan approval. And it's like, Racole, I thought it was the 16th. I need my extra day for my loan approval. I'm like, Jenny, no, it's the 15th. Remember, we were all excited. We were like, and she's like, no, I don't remember. You want to confirm the effective date because all your other dates will rise and fall as it relates to that date. Here's another tip for you. And Paige, you can probably use this. There's a website, timeanddate.com, timeanddate.com. It is a helpful tool to utilize for counting dates, right? So if it says, 10 days from such and such, or 12 days from this particular date, or 13 days from this particular date, it's a great tool for that. I mean, you can pull out your calendar. Of course, that works. But in case you have some weird dates and you kind of just want to be super, super, super efficient, you can use www.timeanddate.com. It is a tool to calculate dates. I've used it for forever. I actually use it in litigation for deadlines to respond to complaints, right? So one of the other things that we would do when we were in person was this quick exercise where you guys would receive a contract with it's a sample contract with some, it's already filled in with some deadlines for the parties. So I want you guys to do me a favor, grab your phones, go to 2019, and let me know what the when the first escrow deposit is due for this contract. Drop it in the chat. It's due from 2 days from Thursday, April 4th. Drop it in the chat. And then when is the second escrow deposit due? Drop it in the chat. I see we got some responses on the first escrow deposit. Good job. Thank you, guys. And when is the second escrow deposit due? Drop it in the chat. The second escrow deposit is due within 10 days of the effective date. And with our effective date being April 4th, 2019. Okay. And then the last date that our sample contract had was the loan application was due within 2 days of the effective date. You're welcome, Sherry. Within 2 days of the effective date was the loan application. So when is the loan application due? If our effective date is April 4th, 2019. Thank you. Thank you for answering, you guys. All right. Thank you so much. So, first escrow deposit is due April 8th because Saturday. The 6th, 2 days from the 4th, it was a Saturday. And the second escrow deposit is due on April 15th because 4/14 is a Saturday. The loan approval is due on April 8th because 4/6 is a Saturday. I always like to start out there, but it gets easy after that. So, computing time periods. This is the FAR bar as is. You want to beware of deadlines that end on weekends and national holidays. Beware of deadlines that end on weekends and national holidays. In the contract, it specifically says, this language is lifted directly from the contract. It says, other than time for acceptance and the effective date. Other than time for acceptance and the effective date, any time periods provided for or dates specified within the contract that end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday shall extend to 5 p.m. where the property is located of the next business day. Let's break this down. Other than time for acceptance and the effective date, meaning in the section where it says the contract, here's the deadline to accept the contract. If it's July 4th, it's July 4th. Put the hot dog down and let me know if you're accepting this contract. Sorry, right? Or the effective date. Same with the effective date. I received the, you sent the contract back on July 4th. That's the effective date. Those two dates do not change just because they occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. You guys got to remember that. Those two dates do not change. Every other date, if it ends or occurs on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday, that's the other thing you want to be clear on, not just your personal holiday, national legal holiday. Then the deadline will extend to the next business day, 5 p.m., not 11:59. So in our exercise, the first escrow deposit will be due by Monday, April 8th at 5 p.m. Not 7, not 6, not 2 a.m. It's 5 p.m. The next business day, where the property is located. That's the other thing. You're vacationing in Tahiti. You're buying a property in Florida. It's 5 o'clock in Florida, not 5 o'clock in Tahiti. Deadlines. Other than time for acceptance and effective date, any time periods provided for a date specified within the contract that end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or national holiday shall extend to 5 p.m. where the property is located on the next business day. The next point I want to make with regards to computing timelines, the effective date is, consider it day 0. That's the other question that we get. Is the effective date day 1? No, the effective date is day 0. The next day is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? The effective date is day 0. The effective date does not count in the calculation of your 2 days to deposit the escrow deposit, 3 days to deposit, 10 days, 8 days is not included. The effective date is day 0. All right, so now we're going to go through some of the high points of the deadlines in our contract, and we're going to talk about, remember, what's the seller's rights, obligations, expectations, what should they be concerned about? Also, what should the buyer be concerned about as it relates to that particular deadline? I hope you guys can breathe. Those who got it right, congratulations. Those that missed the buyer date, don't worry about it. You won't do it again. It's all good. It's all good. It's best to get that wrong in this test environment. That's what these classes are all about. So I promise you it's going to be easy from this point forward. If you're eating your lunch, I don't want you to get indigestion. So escrow deposit. What is the seller concerned about as it relates to the escrow deposit? The seller wants to ensure that the escrow letter is received. That confirms that the escrow deposit has been made. It will be the worst thing to get all the way down to the end of a transaction and you have a dispute and you say, well, at least we have the escrow deposit, right? We do have the escrow deposit, right? I said that we do have the escrow deposit, right? And no one's sure. So you want to ensure, the seller wants to ensure, if you're representing the seller, you want to ensure that the escrow is received by a confirmation of the escrow letter. The buyer, what is the buyer concerned about at the escrow deposit deadline? First of all, understand that it is a breach to miss this deadline. It is a 100% a breach of contract to miss this deadline. Now, if it's your first escrow deposit, what are you at risk of? The contract being canceled, really. Obviously, you haven't put any money in. And for those of you who think, oh, I can go after an escrow deposit, well, listen, they haven't even put the money in. So what are we talking about right now? Like, if the escrow deposit hasn't been made, unless the escrow deposit was supposed to be $1 million, I'm not sure that I would suggest that you try and go after an escrow deposit that has not been made. It's just not the best use of your time. To me, I would just carry on. Now, if it is your second escrow deposit that has not been made, a first has already been made, again, now your first escrow deposit is at risk for being retained by the seller. The other thing that the buyer needs to be sure of as it relates to the escrow deposit is if they're wiring, you want to ensure that the wire instructions are sent directly to the buyer by the escrow agent. You guys, please stop asking the title agent to send you the wire instructions so that you can send them to your client. Please. Here's why. In the event that there is an attempt to commit wire fraud, you want to be sure that there was never an instance that your email, that you actually sent wire instructions to your client. You want to be sure that someone does not commit wire fraud by creating an email address. Because here's the deal. You guys know how to create an email address, right? The email address could be 123mainstreet@gmail.com, but I'm going to name it Jerry Kopinski. And it's going to look like it's coming from Jerry Kopinski. And they're going to lift Jerry's signature block and put it in there. And so for all intents and purposes, unless your client looks closely at the actual email address, For all they know, it's the email from Jerry Kopinski with my wire instructions for my cash to close. That's the same thing he did when I made my escrow deposit. So why should I be concerned about getting an email from Jerry now? See how that happens? So stop. Don't ever let it be a chance that your client expects to receive escrow instructions from you. Do not. Your title agent should be delivering wire instructions securely through a portal so that your client gets into the habit of expecting those important documents to be received securely, as well as having the instructions to call back to the title agent to confirm the instructions that they received. This is so serious. I would also suggest that you take it a step further and place in your business email signature line that the clients can never expect to receive email to receive wire instructions from you via email. Just make it part of your standard signature line. You will never receive wire instructions from me. All communication regarding wire instructions should be made with the title agent. Always call, not email the title agent to confirm wire instructions, and email is not sufficient. I would suggest that you put that in your signature block and get your clients in the habit of expecting those wire instructions to come from the title agent, as well as not just receiving them, but also making a phone call to confirm them. All right, I'm off my soapbox. Hope that I made that point clear. The next deadline is the inspection period. You want to ensure that any agreements made regarding the inspection period are documented in writing and signed by the buyer and seller before expiration of the inspection period. What does that mean? We conduct the inspection and there's some watermarks in the ceiling. Or let's take it a step further. Let's say there's some tiles in the pool that need to be repaired. I suggest that you extend the inspection period if the agreement is going to be to make that repair versus just giving a credit for the repair after closing. If there's an agreement to make particular repairs that are very important, that are vital to the client feeling like that their desires have been met, I suggest that you extend that inspection period to allow for those repairs to be made during the inspection period. Because once you get outside of the inspection period, your only other reason to cancel, unless the addendum provides for client can still cancel the contract specifically in the event that they're not satisfied. Now, what does that even mean? What does satisfied mean, right? With the repairs that are made. 9 times out of 10, that's not being done. What we're doing is we're going through the inspection period. We're saying these repairs need to be made. We allow the inspection period to end. And then there's a dispute as to whether or not the repairs were made appropriately. If the repairs are that important, extend that inspection period until those repairs are made and ensure that those repairs are made accordingly before the inspection period ends. Right? The other point is, again, it's highlighted that the agreements are made in writing and signed by the buyer and seller. Not an email from the agent. That's not sufficient. The agreement to buy and sell real estate is between the buyer and the seller. And so any changes to their initial agreement must be affirmed and confirmed by signatures from the buyer and the seller. That's it. No email. Well, the agent said, I know what they said. Maybe that's a different conversation to be had with the agent, but you cannot enforce that agreement to extend against the seller because the seller didn't sign, right? Pro agent tip, as you're working through the transaction, if you're representing the buyer, obviously we're the resource for information, but I suggest that you provide the buyer with multiple options for a property inspection and have the client decide who they're going to use. Give them 3 options. Choose one of these inspectors, because it will be the worst thing, although it does happen, that post-closing, the buyer comes back and says, there was mold in the wall. There was a leak in the roof. There was a hole in this wall. And the inspector you gave me missed it. And you're like, what? You never want that. You never want the client to say that it's your fault because they use the inspector that you suggested. So give them 3 options, let them decide. All right. Now, the next deadline is the appraisal. You want to consider providing a deadline for the appraisal to be completed. Here's why. You want to know whether there's going to be an issue concerning price sooner than later. We don't want to get way down the road and they're saying, oh, the property didn't appraise, and so now they're trying to blow out of the deal. Listen, and I've had this question before. Someone says, well, we can't make the lender orders the appraisal. We can't make them. Yes, you can. You let that lender know, listen, we've agreed to have this appraisal completed within 10 days of the effective date. So we must have this appraisal completed, or we're in default, or the appraisal term is waived, right? So all these different liabilities that we have. So on the listing side, you might want to consider that, because again, you want to have that conversation sooner than later. And then what will you do if the property does not appraise? This is something to consider, because it happens. What if the property does not appraise? In this market, it's probably not going to appraise, and we already know it, right? Because properties are selling over market price and over appraisal, and that's kind of what we're doing right now. But in a normal market, what are we doing if the property does not appraise for the contract price? Are we going to cancel the contract? Is the seller going to reduce the price? Is the buyer going to pay the difference? Or are we going to contest the appraisal? These are all things to consider as we move through the transaction process from contract to close. Now, contesting the appraisal, that's kind of old school. I haven't seen many people be effective at that recently. It's not even worth it. I mean, again, and this is a different market, but let's talk about the prior market and potentially a market to come. Is that something that you want to consider? You might. I have some realtors who are very effective in it and do not see it as a waste of their time, and some that are saying that's so old and that's not even worth having a conversation anymore. Buyer paying the difference, that's where we're at today, right? Buyers they're bringing cash to close to make up the difference between their loan amount and the agreed upon purchase price. Will the seller reduce the price in today's market? Probably not. Will you cancel the contract? Probably not, right? But again, these are all some things to consider as we meet the appraisal milestone in the contract to close process. The loan approval milestone, very important. What's important to the seller? What will the seller do if the initial loan approval deadline is not met? It happens. It happens. Will your seller cancel the contract? Just say, listen, I cannot be bothered with this. I don't trust it. I don't know what their lender is doing. They should have gotten their loan approval. We've already given them 30 days. I can't wait. Will the seller extend the loan approval deadline, but with a non-refundable additional earnest money deposit? Will they say, we'll give you an additional 10 days, but we need to see an additional $5,000 in escrow that's non-refundable? Which asterisk, non-refundable, does not mean that it's going to go directly to you in the event of default. Let's always keep that in mind. There's a default provision. There's a dispute resolution provision in our FABR as is contract that provides for what? You got to go to mediation first, then you go to trial, etc. So it's money that's there, but just know that in the event of default, it doesn't just turn into, especially if the buyer does not execute a release of the escrow deposit, the title agent is not just going to release the money without a release and cancellation. So I just want to make sure I put that there in case anyone had questions about how that whole process works. The other option is, will the seller begin accepting backup offers? And there's a couple other options that you have, but this is something to consider. What if the loan approval deadline is not met? Now, the buyer needs to be vigilant about meeting this deadline. At this milestone, I always say, listen, this one, you cannot blow this milestone. There is no excuse. Tattoo it in your hand, your forehead, put it on your mirror. There is no excuse to ever, ever, ever miss the loan approval deadline for a buyer. This is like fatal. What if I don't have a loan approval yet? You want to get an extension if needed and request in advance, and you want to document the terms in a fully executed addendum. You want to be sure that the loan approval deadline is extended. Additionally, once you do receive a loan approval, you want to make sure that it makes sense. Why, if the loan approval looks just like the first approval with the conditions, that I wouldn't be too comfortable with, right? You don't want just a loan approval just to say that you met the loan approval deadline, because at that point, that's the buyer's last opportunity to get out of the transaction, right? And I'm going to tell you, again, today's market is different. However, if you need 3 extensions, you need to ask for 3 extensions. The question was asked earlier, what are we doing about these institutional lenders that are not acknowledging the deadlines? Well, guess what? You got to have a conversation with your buyer and say, listen, it is my responsibility to educate you and advocate on your behalf. Your lender does not appear to appreciate or be abiding by this deadline. We got to do something. We had a transaction where we literally had to tell the buyer, like, listen, we hate to have to cancel this transaction. She was on her 3rd extension. We told her, listen, the sellers may or may not agree to this extension. So I want to prepare you that in the event that they do not extend this, agree to extend, we need to cancel, or we need to consider canceling. And again, it's the buyer's decision to make, but do understand that if we do not cancel and you do ultimately not get this loan approval, then your $20,000 escrow deposit is at stake. Does that make sense? So you give the client the responsibility, and they ultimately make the decision whether or not they want to proceed without having a loan approval. But again, you as their realtor should absolutely educate them on, hey, listen, this lender is not responding. Can I tell you, it happens, and it's not pretty. I've had files where the lender just goes dark, and we're like, wow, they're not responding. They're not saying anything. And again, realtor, that's at that point where you got to have that tough conversation with your client about the lender not responding to a discussion about the loan approval. All right. This is a big one. This is a big one. You don't want to miss this one. Make sure that's, again, tattooed on your hand, wherever you need to be. And if you don't have that loan approval, then you want to get an extension of the loan approval. And if possible, also the closing date, because generally, if the lender needed more time to get the loan approved, then they're probably going to need that same amount of time or close to get the file closing ready. So keep that in mind. Association approval. You want to note the deadline to cancel the contract if the association approval is not received. There is a deadline to cancel the contract if the association approval is not received, and that's on the buyer and the seller side. The seller needs to know that, because the buyer could blow out of the deal because they have not received their association approval. And I will tell you, I've seen transactions where, because it was left blank, I think it provides for 5 days or 4 days before closing, because that line was left blank and the buyer already wanted to get out of the contract, they utilized that provision, and the association was late in getting the approval. They utilized that provision to cancel the contract. They said, well, you know what? They were trying to come up with every other reason. They said, oh, we don't have our approval. And the writer says, we have 5 days prior to closing to cancel the contract if we don't have our approval. And they cancel the contract. So that's a lesson in not leaving not leaving it blank for a listing agent, as well as watching it. Right? There is another chance for the buyer to get out of the contract because they don't have association approval. Now, with that being said, you also want to consider on the listing side that a requirement that the buyer initiates the association approval process immediately, as it may take longer than anticipated. If you have not already, you will possibly come across an association that's only open on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1:13 to 2:14 p.m. And you're like, what? Actually, no, they're only open on the 2nd Tuesday and the 4th Thursday from 1:13 to 2:14 p.m. So catch us during that time. If not, we'll see you next month, right? And it happens. And so for that reason, you want to initiate the association approval process immediately, because you just never know which one you're going to get. And then once you receive the estoppel, you want to ensure that you review the completed estoppel for the requirements and the terms. Okay. Again, how to review the estoppel, we went over that in our closing for realtors class, but just at a very high level, that estoppel is going to tell you if there's any HOA violations. It's going to tell you if the buyer must obtain association approval, if an interview is required, if there whatever costs are associated, is the property, are the association dues delinquent, are they current, what is the association dues, are there any capital contributions? And so you want to be sure that the that estoppel is reviewed with your client once it's received. Also, sometimes the title agent may require an original copy of the association approval for recording. That comes from the title commitment. It doesn't happen all the time, but some association documents, just so you guys know where that comes from and why you may have it on some files and not others, that comes from the association's recorded declarations. And within the deck, it says that the approval must be recorded with the deed. And so when that comes up in a title exam, that's when you'll see the title agent asking you for an actual approval, because their requirements say that they must record that approval with the deed. And so again, you may see it on some and not on others. And so that's an explanation of why that's the case, right? So that's the association approval milestone. The survey milestone. Requested the survey not be scheduled until after the inspection period is completed. Yes, that's generally still the case. However, in today's market, everyone's backed up, guys. And when I tell you everyone is backed up because everyone wants to close tomorrow. Even surveyors are taking much longer than they would take. And so generally after the inspection period is fine. And the reason why this happens is because the survey is one of the more expensive searches that is completed. And so we want to ensure that there's not an unnecessary expense. If this deal ends up blowing out, we don't want the buyer to have incurred an unnecessary expense. And so it may not necessarily be, the inspection period should be fine. I mean, you guys shouldn't have super long inspection periods. So just be sure that it's not essentially not ordered right away. That's for sure, because unless you have a quick closing, then yes. But if you have a 30-day closing, you could generally give them about 14 to 21 days on average to get that done. So about 7 days after you open the file for closing, you should be looking at ordering a survey. And then the other point on that is the buyer in a cash transaction may waive the survey. What does that mean? With regards to their owner's policy, it will result in the buyer not having a Form 9, is what we call as a survey coverage, and that's coverage for the boundary lines of the property. The lender is always going to require it, unless it's a private lender, but most institutional lenders are generally always going to require a survey, so there's never a conversation there. But if your buyer is a cash buyer, the title agent will ask them, would you like us to order a survey so that you could get the survey coverage on your title insurance policy? And so that's where that dialogue is coming from when you see that come up at the survey milestone. The title commitment milestone in the contract, it specifically says failure to timely deliver the title commitment to the buyer is a breach of the contract. You want to, once the title commitment is issued by the title agent, you want to review the title commitment to acquaint yourself with any title matters that the title agent will be working on with the buyer, and seller to resolve. What do I mean by that? Probate, if there is a prior divorce, title agent may ask for the marital settlement agreement, and that's just like pulling a band-aid or a scab off of a wound. And so they're like, why are you asking me for that? And then they're mad and they call you all irate. And so if you know, and obviously you're like the middleman, and so you want to look at that title commitment just to acquaint yourself, like, oh God, I might get a phone call about this one. Also, if there's probate, if they're asking for death certificates, or if there are judgments, or if there's a mortgage that your client didn't tell you about, You guys did the listing consultation, and you know, you're trying to come up with price, and they tell you that they have one mortgage, and from that you guys assume that they're going to net, you know, $40,000. Title commitment comes back and there's a second mortgage for 80, which has them bringing 40 to the table. You're like, wait a minute. They said they had one mortgage. Where's the second mortgage coming from? So again, it's not your responsibility to clear title, but you kind of want to make yourself, just to acquaint yourself with what they're working through. Because the other thing is that it may extend your closing a little bit, right? If probate comes up and they've told you, your client tells you they've already conducted probate, and title commitment comes back showing no, they haven't, we're going to be extending that closing date for sure. Right? Lien search and permit search milestone. When using the as-is contract, you guys know that the seller is not obligated to close out open permits. You guys also should know that open permits are not title issues. So unless there is additional language in the contract that the seller will close out open permits, the seller only needs to cooperate with the buyer's efforts to close out open permits. That's their only obligation. They do not have to close out open permits. And so pro agent tip, if you're representing the buyer, consider adding the additional term language that the seller will be responsible for closing out all open permits, code violations prior to closing at their expense. You generally see it on all contracts now. I rarely see them where the language isn't there, especially if you're representing the buyer. You're always going to put that language there. If you're representing the seller, you're like, what are you talking about? What language? I'm just kidding. You're not trying to avoid passing clear title, but again, you want to make sure that that's there, because the new FAR contract does not have a requirement that the open permits be closed out. All right. Now, also with that, let's say an open permit does come up and you find out that it's going to take longer to close out, then it'll be beyond the closing date. Then you might want to consider doing an escrow holdback, right? Let's say it's for, I don't know, fences, right? There's an open permit for some fencing that was installed to the property. For all intents and purposes, you assume that the fencing was done properly. The contractor just never went and closed out the permit. You do want to hold back. You do want to hold back some money on that, just to ensure that, let's say in the event the city says, actually, this is not installed properly. What is the cost to repair it? What is the most money that it will cost to repair that fence? Consider holding that back, so that you can go to closing. And then obviously, once the permit is closed out and you guys are all clear that the fence was installed properly, then you will do a release of the holdback. Alternatively, maybe you decide you're not concerned about the open permit. Fence is the fence. It is what it is. We're not dealing with it. Then you probably do a hold harmless. The title agent is going to want the parties to sign a hold harmless, saying you are aware that there was an open permit. You've agreed to close without closing out or addressing the permit, and so you're going to hold us harmless for this particular issue. Again, noting that the jacket on the title commitment and the policy already excludes open permits, but hey, we obviously want to dot our I's and cross our T's, so you may be, don't be surprised if you're asked to sign that. And then the final walkthrough. I don't think people are missing their final walkthroughs, but if you are, you want to ensure that you go to the property and ensure that it is in this expected condition and all of the expected fixtures are there. Now, this definitely happens. You know, chandeliers are removed, ceiling fans are removed, appliances, washer and dryer are removed, and they shouldn't be based on the terms of the contract. So you definitely want to ensure that you do that final walkthrough as close to the closing date as possible too. I always say, I think the walls have ears. They know when the property's for sale and closing day is coming up, because all of a sudden the pipes burst. I've had that happen a number of times, right? What else happens? The AC goes out. It's just all type of weird stuff. And the property was just fine. But the day of closing, all of a sudden it's hot or the roof is leaking. So you want to ensure that the property is in the expected condition. And the last thing in preparation for closing, you want to make sure that the client does not schedule any vacations immediately before or after closing. This is specific to the buyer, right? The seller, I know generally, especially in our office, the seller can sign early. and get their stuff out of the way. But buyers, do not schedule any vacations immediately before or after the closing date, or what you think will be after the closing date, because the closing date could move due to the financing issues. And then you want to advise your buyers, if possible, to take the day off for closing. We waited to the finish line. If at all possible, ask them to take the day off, because you never know what could happen. If you guys have been to closing before, you know that there is that funding approval process, and we're at it. It is your client's one closing, and they're the one person in the world that they're concerned about their closing. 9 times out of 10, your lender has a number of other buyers that are closing all over the nation, and so you're kind of going to get in line for funding approval. And some lenders are quicker about it than others, but I've seen some take a pretty long time. And so you want to prepare your clients that this could be a pretty lengthy process outside of the 150 pages of documents they're going to sign. You have to wait for the lender to give their funding approval. So if at all possible, take the day off, or at the very least, schedule about 4 hours for closing. Make sure that they know that this is not something that they can do in their lunch break, right? This is not a lunch break event appointment. This is something that's going to take a little bit longer. And then you also want to advise the buyers to wire their cash to close well before the scheduled closing time, if at all possible. The lender's on their A game. We have our finalized CD. We know our cash to close. Have them schedule that wire sooner, especially, and you don't have to get all into the details of their financing, but just suggesting in passing, if they're with a credit union or if the funds are coming from an investment account, they for sure want to give that wire at least a 24-hour processing period, because they take longer. Additionally, they should not try to wire their cash to close from their banking account online, because again, those also take time. If at all possible, unless they're going to be in the closing agent's account, escrow account by the day of closing. If it's the day of closing, then they should just go into the bank and get that wire initiated by someone in the branch. All right. And then lastly, updates and communications. This is everyone's biggest pain point, or one of the things that you're celebrated on if you're doing it well. And that is providing updates and communicating with your client. Pro agent tip: you want to confirm the transaction progress, and task completion should be completed weekly. You should send out an email to your clients each week to say, hey, we're on track. We got, last week we completed our inspection period. All is well. There's nothing for you to be concerned about. It's all good. If you can do that weekly, you're going to provide stellar service, as well as it'll keep you on track as well, to make sure that you're following the deadlines in your transaction. And then here, this is just a quick screenshot of, this is an example of the document that we've given out in our in-person courses. And it's just a quick sheet where it is an abstract of all your deadlines. Now, in this technological age, I would assume that you have like Dotloop or some other CRM that will allow you to have an abstract of your deadlines electronically. But good old paper and pen never hurt anybody, right? So if you have one of these sheets printed out for every one of your properties, you have it in your binder and you just flip through, make whatever changes, notating, what are your important deadlines for that transaction. It's always good. A good backup, it never hurts. So we'll send that email over, that document over in the email with the recording. And then another pro agent tip: transaction coordinators. This is where your transaction coordinators, this is where the need for a TC was born, right? This is where you get your leverage. Transaction coordinators are extremely helpful in assisting with managing timelines, processing documents, and delivery of information to parties. They are not the realtor. Although you may have a licensed transaction coordinator, which is always great. I mean, they can obviously have a different level of conversation, but at the end of the day, that's your transaction. You do not take a property you don't go under contract, throw the contract to your TC and like, oh, they got it. No. It's still yours. And what the TC does is they take off the administrative duties. This is one of the first places you're going to gain leverage as a realtor. I always say you're responsible. Once you get under contract, you should be gone to the next contract. Once you're listed, you should be gone to the next listing. You should be working on the next listing, right? And so the transaction coordinators are very, 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 very helpful in working with you and allowing you to take that timeline responsibility off you. Now, here's one thing. You obviously still have oversight of your TC. And so that is where, that's where these sheets come in, or your electronic calendar comes in to follow what your TC should be working on. What email should you be CC'd on? And well, this is our deadline for a loan approval. I haven't seen this loan approval yet. TC, where are we with that? So you always want to consider working with a TC. And again, the other thing that I always say too, I use this as an example. It's the worst thing to be in a class, right? And you get an email from title asking you for an information sheet. And you're like, so now you can't even focus on anything else. You're only halfway through the class, and in your mind, you're like, oh, what do you mean they didn't send the information sheet? I thought they got the, that shouldn't be your concern. Let that be on your TC. It's an information sheet, right? A copy of photo ID. That shouldn't be your concern. Put that on a TC so you can focus on your highest and best use. So guys, we've made our way through the transaction. We've hit the high points. What you should be concerned about. Again, it's all about managing expectations. It's all about managing a timeline. Once you hit that timeline, now, you should feel comfortable about what am I going to be concerned with at each point. So now I'm going to jump into the chat and take these questions. Let's see here. I'm going to roll all the way to the top and take some of these questions. If the seller does not accept the offer by the effective date, do we need to adjust the effective date to match the date of the acceptance? So the question is, if the seller does not accept the offer by the acceptance date, is what you're saying, do we need to adjust the effective date to match the date of the acceptance? So remember, your effective date is not, it's moving. It's always moving. You wouldn't be adjusting an effective date, because your effective date is going to be the date that the contract is accepted and delivered, right? So you're not necessarily adjusting the effective date. I've gotten this question before, and I completely understand what you're asking. You're saying, do we change the acceptance date, right?
Correct.
So
I meant to say the acceptance.
have an offer where let's say the acceptance date is April 15th, and as written in the contract, but the seller doesn't accept it until April 16th. Do we need to change the effective date? No.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the acceptance date. No, you do not. They've accepted it.
Correct. That's what I meant to say, is the acceptance date.
Yes, I've gotten that question before, so I completely understand what you're asking. No, you don't have to move it. If it's already been accepted, they've essentially, what we call, you've ratified it by your actions, that you've accepted that date. So you don't have to change it. But that's a good question, because I get it all the time.
Thank you.
Use Zachem for escrow deposit, so confirmation goes to all parties automatically. That's a good Zachem. If you guys haven't heard of it, it's essentially a online platform for use of escrow deposits. What is the proper way for a buyer to cancel a contract before making the deposit? Do we still need to send a cancel and release, and what the escrow deposit is supposed to be? I would keep it clean. Why not? Just do a release. I mean, obviously you're not doing, you're not releasing an escrow deposit that hasn't been made, but it doesn't hurt to just go ahead and send that release and cancellation. Does the seller have to respond to repair requests on that? Nope. That's a very good question. And we go over that on the as is FAR bar, the contract class. The seller does not have to respond to a request on an as-is contract. That is the co-essence of an as-is contract. In comparison to the CRISP comes from a place of the seller will make repairs in the amount of $500. The as-is contract is saying you're taking this property as is. That's it. Now, the next discussion as it relates to that is, although we initiate this transaction from a place of you're accepting this property as is, we can agree to make repairs, right? So we're starting from as is, but we can move the line a little bit and make these 3 repairs. That's totally up to the parties to agree to that. That's a very good question. It comes up all the time. Can the buyer accept request repairs? Yeah, they can request it. The seller can say no, but the buyer can always request it. And so what you sometimes get is a seller saying, they can't ask me for repairs. This is an as-is contract. Well, they can ask, but you can say no. But in the event that you do agree to it, that is fully acceptable. Regarding the inspection period, can the addendum include verbiage to read repairs are to be made accordingly prior to closing date or something like this, or is extending? Again, yeah, repairs are definitely going to be made prior to the closing date, but now you're getting into, were those repairs made according to your standards? So yeah, I've made the repairs. I've slapped some paint over the mold. That's my repair, right? But is that what you're okay with? And so that's the point we want to be clear on. When you have some significant repairs that could make a break or deal, the suggestion is to just extend that inspection period to ensure that the repairs are made according to your client's expectations. How many days for the appraisal? It's whatever you agree to. You know, maybe you say the appraisal needs to be completed 10 days after the effective date. Outside of that, there is no specific deadline for the appraisal. What time do you suggest for the appraisal? Again, it all that. So the other use of this purchase contract date abstract that I find helpful is it allows you to make sure that your dates make sense, right? Because when you get the contract, you get those 12 pages and you say, okay, escrow deposit this date, second deposit this date, closing date this date, loan approval, loan application. How are you making sure that those dates jive? Because guess what still happens? We still get contracts where the loan approval deadline falls after the closing date, because no one looked to see whether these dates make sense. So that's another use of, if you have a contract that makes sense and looking like you want to accept it, price makes sense, you know, they have good financing, they're over at market price. Well, now let's make sure that these dates make sense, that you don't find yourself, you know, accepting a contract where the loan approval deadline is the day after or the day of or the day before closing, right? How will we force the lender to complete? You ask them, or you vote with your feet. You take your business somewhere else. That's just it. You can't get my appraisal done in 10 days? Oh, well, let me go find a lender that can. Can listing agent ask buyer to waive appraisal contingency and pay the difference? You can ask, but here again, that's going to get into financing. What if the buyer's lender is not going for it? And I had this conversation, I think last week on this, when it comes to FHA loans. Remember, FHA has a lot of built-in protections. And so, yeah, you can ask them to waive the appraisal contingency and pay the difference. But now, is the lender going to be able to abide by that agreement is what you're looking at. Just had an issue where the appraiser was in a car accident. And Jeff, there is more than one appraiser in the world. I'm just going to tell you, I feel sorry for him. But if it was my listing, that would be my response. I will send you the number to an appraiser if that's the problem. You know what I mean? So yeah, they can't. They gotta do better than that. Can we have the non-refundable deposit for extension of appraisal be passed through the seller at time of the additional? Can we have the non-refundable? Can we have the non-refundable deposit for extension of appraisal be passed through to seller at time of the additional deposit? Beryl, you want to come off mute and clarify that question for me? if you're still here. I'm gonna keep going if you're in a bad spot right now, if you're just listening. Just because I want to be sure that I'm answering your question properly. Who is responsible to push the association to get everything on time, the listing agent or the buying agent? If they're bad enough, both of you. I've seen a joint effort in that one. I'll be honest with you. When is the best time to request this? Sorry, Sherry, I wasn't looking at the chat during the discussion. If you want to come off mute and clarify that question, I'll be happy to answer. There's always that surprise permit. Yep, there's always that surprise. Yep. Buyer can get away with the transaction. Let's say the seller did not close it on time, assuming there's an additional clause. Not sure, Paola.
Racole, this is Beryl.
Okay.
What was the question I asked you? I asked you quite a few.
So the first one was, can we have the non-refundable deposit for extension of appraisal be passed through to seller at time of the additional deposit?
Right. What I'm talking about is if you're going to have basically an additional deposit to extend the appraisal, then as a result of that, instead of waiting until escrow cancels or whatever, why can't we not pass that monies to the seller directly at that time rather than waiting? Okay, it is possible. Okay.
Yep, they can absolutely agree to that. I just had a closing like that, actually. Okay. Yeah, I think theirs was for, I think it was related to their financing, where we released the escrow deposit to the seller. They agreed. Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you.
No problem.
Racole.
Yep.
It's Sherry.
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good.
You kind of already answered that for me. We were what I was trying to ask you is, like, when you get the effective date of an executed contract, and how many days should you from acceptance do the appraisal? That's what I was trying to ask, because my agent and I were actually having that meeting yesterday, and we're going to actually start trying to maybe start putting that on our contracts. And when I was learning to be a TC, I got conflicted information where it's like 10 days before closing, 14 days before closing. So I was just trying to kind of get a variance of that, to go more in detail with you about it, but you kind of already answered that for me, if that helps.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and then again, you have to be mindful of what's going on in the market too, right? There's a lot of financing going on, but it doesn't change that you want that appraisal sooner than later, because again, you don't want that to be an out for the buyer unnecessarily. And you've gotten so far down the path in the transaction. That's something that you definitely want to address sooner than later. So that's a good question.
And it's been happening a lot more where we're not putting a depth detail on the contract, and then it's taking forever. And then, like right now, we have one we're working on that I've been trying for like a week and a half to try to find out when the appraisal is being scheduled. So that's why we were talking about putting a specific date on the contract so that this doesn't continue happening.
That's right.
So thank you for your help.
Not a problem.
Raquel, this is Wendy.
Hey.
Hi. So just in regards to that as well. So in the as-is contract right now, there is no specific line as it relates to appraisal, correct? It's
right.
All lumped in under financing contingency, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let's see here. 1 second. To check lien and permit search using appraisal before putting property. Yes, it's definitely legal to check your lien and permit search, and to use an appraisal before putting a property on the market. Absolutely. So that's actually a kind of like a marketing tactic, honestly, to use an appraiser if you're a listing agent and you want to get a clear or more accurate, if you're battling with sellers that are like, oh, the property's worth 500, they think it's worth $1 million. You're like, okay, well, I have an appraiser that will do a pencil search for us to give us a more accurate pricing. So yes, this is 100% legal to do that. And with the lien and permit search, yes, absolutely. I've very often given the contact information to the company that we use for lien and permit searches for realtors to go to them directly for their own research as they're preparing for listings, or maybe they're investing in property. But yeah, that service is available to all, and it's legal. Inspections, appraisal, and financial are all counted the same. Lisa, if you're available, come off mic and clarify that. Come off mute, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, by the way.
Not a problem.
I'm a lawyer, and I lived in California for a long time, so thanks. So my impression of the as-is contract here in Florida was that you counted financial days differently. So like days where money is due were counted as business days, and then days where it was either an inspection or something physical were counted in calendar days.
Nope.
So is that not the case at all?
Nope, not the case. They're all the same.
They're all the same.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's a huge point that you made.
No problem, Lisa. And call me, girl. I went to law school in California, so.
I know. I just sent you a Facebook request, so we'll get caught up on our own time.
All right. Who should be in the inspection, listing or buyer agent? Really both. I don't mind. I think you need to be as a listing agent. You should be at your appraisal. It doesn't hurt for you to be at your inspection. It's your deal. It's your transaction. So you don't want if you want to ensure the integrity of the inspections, then it doesn't hurt for you to be there. Can you recommend a company that outsource what to, Wendy? Let me know. Are you talking about, oh yeah. And we pay per transaction. Yes, I can. Wendy, shoot me an email. I can definitely recommend a company to you. Can a buyer get away with the transaction? Let's say the seller did not close the permit on time or something like that. Did we do that again? Do you release keys at closing or wait for funds to be received? I absolutely wait for funds to be received by my office. I do not wait for funds to be received by the seller, because the same example that I gave about the incoming escrow deposit may take time to be deposited. The title agent's responsibility is to release the funds. Now, how long it takes your bank to get it through all their different channels is not our responsibility, and it is not the buyer's responsibility. And it is nowhere in the contract that says that once the seller's receipt of the funds. That's not what the contract says. The contract says that the title agent will receive the funds, release the funds, and at that time the keys are released. Now, if the buyer and seller make a separate agreement that the keys are not released until the seller receives their funds, and that's different. But understand that the way that the contract is currently written, that is not part of the contract. Could you please explain that the effective date is April 4th and we count 10 days? So yeah, Lisa, that the contract, the effective date was April 4th, and we counted 10 days, which took it to the 15th.
I don't know why, but I'm a little confused with it. If Thursday's day 0, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Friday we count as 1, we don't count Saturday and Sunday, or we continue to count them?
You continue.
Okay.
But you ended on the Sunday, right?
Okay, I understand. Okay, thank you. I got it. Ding, ding, ding. All right.
No problem.
Thank
No
you.
problem. Listen, let me give you guys a secret. This thing says 2019. I've been using this hypothetical because it was like, got it just right. And so I'm not rewriting the curriculum for that zinger. I'll probably be using 2019 and 2030, but who knows? Anyway. Yes. I'll send the presentation out, the recording. How do we add language making the seller responsible for closing out open permits prior to closing at that expense? We are not learning. Yeah. There's standard text. It says, seller will be, this is for Marcelo. Seller will be responsible for closing out all open permits and curing code violations at their expense prior to closing. That's the link. And then most times, I'm surprised your brokerage doesn't have that in their contract. Oftentimes that's like standard language when the contract is drafted. So the language just says, seller will be responsible for closing out all open permits, curing all code violations at their expense prior to closing. That's the language. It's usually late by the time. Which one was late, Jeff?
Hi, Racole.
Hey.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, this lender that I was working with, I mean, they promised this, they promised that, and then it's getting late, and you know, we just had to ask for extensions. I mean, if we started again with a different lender, we'd still have to ask for extensions.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem like there's much we can do except never to work with them again.
Yeah, there's that. And communicate with the listing agent. Just communicate. And then, like you said, just unfortunately not work with them again. I'm sorry. What line on the as-is contract is the appraisal contingency? There is no line in the as-is contract for appraisal contingency, Wendy Jill Potts. There is an appraisal contingency rider, but there is no line in the as-is contract for appraisal contingency. What we often see is that realtors will use the financing clause as their default appraisal contingency. I don't suggest that you do that, but essentially their thought process is that you're backdooring your way into appraisal contingency by virtue of the fact that if the property does not appraise, then the lender will not give the financing, thereby releasing your buyer from the contract, because that is a requirement for the financing. However, be careful that the lender does not issue a loan approval based on what the appraisal does provide for. All right, and like, oh, you didn't get an approval for, you know, this amount, but you got it for that amount. And where that happens is when the financing terms are left blank. And I do a really good, crazy conversation about that, leaving those blank in the contract class. But guys, do not leave that blank whatsoever. Those terms and those financing terms are important to the sellers, to the listing agent, as they are to the buyer's agent. You want to make sure that they make sense. In regards to the question about the time for acceptance and effective date, if the seller does not accept their, yeah, I answered that earlier. Yep. If they accept it after the, if the seller accepts the contract after the acceptance deadline and the buyer is okay with it, then it's 100% and executed contract and effective. Hey Lisa, when is the next one? The next class is actually, I think the next class is the 22nd. It's a 3-hour continuing education class on contracts. Woo! What did I sign up for, guys? I'm gonna need water for that one. So continuing at next Thursday, April 22nd. It should be on the calendar for the board. That's a 3-hour continuing education class on the as-is FAR bar contract review. What is a good time period for a loan approval contract default to 5? That's actually for, I think that's for, you mean the loan application is the default for 5? Default for loan approval is 30 days. In today's market, that's not terrible, but that's about it. Where is the secure and legal place to put the deposits from the buyer? With the escrow agent. Lisa, yep, if you signed up, you will receive the recording. And do we do remote closings? Absolutely, we do. For my broker's office, sure, Susan. Let me know which one specifically. We have, are you talking about the real estate brokerage or the mortgage brokerage? Oh, Jenny, thank you. Jenny said my class may be the best one and she's coming from Zoom fatigue. I know you are. Lisa, thank you. Glad to meet you. Welcome to Florida. Sherry, thank you so much. Jennifer, thank you so much. Thank you guys. Thank you. And 129. Ow! I did it. We were supposed to end at 1:30. I didn't know if I was gonna make it. Thank you guys so much for being here. Listen, it wouldn't be a class without you guys.